So for our next presenter, we have student loan justice founder Alan Collinge. He has combined his own experience as a borrower with knowledge of good faith lending learned over years to confront a problem the U.S. has never seen before. He's taken his research to the media and to Washington and was profiled on 60 Minutes. He authored The Student Loan Scam as well as hundreds of articles. In 2008, he was chosen as a financial hero by CNN Money magazine, and is a former associate scientist in the field of aeronautics at Caltech. Collinge has now devoted himself full-time to student loan justice, and I will turn it over to Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Dustin, Jan, and everybody there in Connecticut. I really appreciate you having me here today. Last time I was in Connecticut, just a quick story, I was visiting the Tort Museum, and I got to meet one of my all-time favorite people in the world, Ralph Nader. So if you haven't had a chance to go to the Tort Museum, I highly recommend it. So I have a presentation here today, and I think, Dustin, you were going to try and organize that. Yep. I can maybe try to share my own desktop. I didn't realize that existed on Zoom.
You can if you want, but if you want us to do it, we can as well. It's up to you.
Okay, let me give it a shot and let's see how it goes. And I may have to default back to Dustin if not. Let's see here. Okay, so, all right, good. I think I can do this. So yeah, thanks for having me. We are the oldest and largest true grassroots citizens group in the country fighting for student loan justice. We've been around since 2006. I found it as the result of my own personal experiences. But what I found was that, in a nutshell, the student loan system is broken. It was broken in 2006. And back in, those days, we owed only around maybe $400 billion or so in student loan debt. Well, today, I'm very sorry to report, we are over $2 trillion today. The official statistic is something like 1.8 trillion, but there's a lot that is not counted in that huge amount of money. The vast majority of the nation's student loan debt, by the way, it's interest and penalties and fees. It's not principal. So I know a lot of people think that's a very large and daunting number, but most of it is air. So there's that. But let me just start out with a couple quick quotes. The problem of debt servitude goes way back, like to Roman times, but even to the founding of this country. People like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Morris, and others, they flirted with debtor's prison. Maybe not George Washington, but certainly Thomas Jefferson did. And Robert Morris, one of the financiers of our revolution, he did at least, I think, either one or two stints in debtor's prison. So the problem is not new. However, today in this country, right now, the most blatant example of lending tyranny is the student loan problem by far. A couple of quotes there. So maybe here's a good piece of data for you for a framework. Year 2000, we owed maybe 150, maybe $200 billion in student loan debt, which at that time was a lot of money, but that just pales in comparison to today. And even with respect to all other revolving consumer debts, which we're looking at here, I say credit cards, but it's more than credit cards that we're looking at here. It's credit cards, it's other revolving lines of credit, other debt instruments that people take out. So we've got this sort of reverse Pac-Man, right? In 2000, it was something like not even 30%, I think, of all revolving consumer debt. As of 4 years ago, it was the majority of all revolving consumer debt. So that's just like, what's going on here? We're talking about student loans. What's going on? So other very important points of fact that you need to be aware of. So students in 2004, they were only borrowing about a third of what people are having to borrow today for college. Well, the default rate for that group of people was 40%. So the economy hasn't gotten incredibly better since then. The borrowing has tripled. The price of college has maybe not tripled, but it's certainly, I would say it's doubled at least. And more to the point, more recently, before this pandemic, I was speaking to the former head of the Federal Student Aid Office, Wayne Johnson. And he told me in March of last year, so just as COVID was beginning to come around, that 80% of all federal student loan borrowers, and by the way, federal loans are like 87% of all student debt. So it's the lion's share. 80% of those borrowers were never going to be able to pay. They were either unable to pay or they were paying, but their balances were going up. And the vast majority of that group were that first cohort, the people who just couldn't pay. It's like 65%. This is particularly important for African Americans. As of 2007, the default rate for African Americans was 5 times higher than the average rate. Well, today, it's impossible to be 5 times higher because that would be like 300% or something. But suffice it to say that people of color, particularly African Americans, have historically been just ravaged by these loans. And, I would say it's gotten even worse since 2007. Just turn on your TV for 30 minutes and I guarantee you will probably see at least one commercial for a for-profit college. And you will probably see black and brown people on those commercials. That's who they're marketing to. Now, these for-profit colleges, a long time ago, when I first started doing this, the default rate for those colleges was like 60%. So it's easily 85 or 90% now, which is just ridiculous. By way of comparison, I'm talking a lot about default rates. Hopefully that is meaningful to you. But if not, so the default rate for subprime home mortgages was 20%, so 1 in 5. Well, we are looking at a default rate for African Americans just off the charts right now, like 85 or more percent. But for everybody walking around today with student loans, my best estimate is that the default rate will be 75%, probably more. So we're talking about a default rate that's like 4 times higher nearly than the subprime home mortgage default rate. So I don't think there's really much more data I can provide to you to prove that this is a failed lending system. And I don't mean like failed, like failing. It's not like subprime where, 20% of the people got hurt. We're talking about 80%. And, my biggest battle is with the media, and maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later. But, I cannot seem to convince even one reporter to simply look at this data and come to the very same conclusion that any rational person should come to, and that this is a failed lending system. And a couple of other side notes I'll go through quickly. The forgiveness programs that we hear about, they're all cruel jokes. 99.99, I kid you not, percent of everybody who tries for these forgiveness programs gets disqualified out because the Department of Education has no desire, and its contractors, no desire, no intentions of canceling loans. This lending system is being run in the worst of bad faith. One bit of very recent research that we broke in many places, Business Insider, Yahoo News, turns out that over a third of states in this country, the people of those states owe more in student loan debt than the entire state budgets. So like the state of Georgia, for example, their budget is $48 billion. The people of Georgia owe $82 billion in student loan debt. Now, that's enough to buy every farm in Georgia twice. So, I could go on with these just insane comparisons, but suffice it to say, so the people most affected, as I mentioned, African Americans inordinately. But, there's a lot of other groups that we can really point to. Women hold 2/3 of all student debt. Another piece of recent research people aren't aware of, this is not a younger person's problem. This is an intergenerational thing. There are more people over the age of 50 with student loans than there are under the age of 25. So all the stuff you see on the news about these young kids, overcharging for college, borrowing too much. No. The highest balance borrowers are over 50, and they borrowed far less. This is a predatory lending system. And just to that point, I noticed a lot of veterans wind up getting screwed on their student loans. And also, of the states that owe more than their entire state budgets in student loan debt, most of them are, historically anyways, red states. It's like Georgia, Alabama, Texas, South Carolina, Indiana, on and on, Ohio, Florida. So these are just the numbers. You can, and I can provide this this data to you. You can go to our website as well, studentloanjustice.org, and look at the data for yourselves. It's quite jaw-dropping. These are the states that are underwater, where their people owe more than their state budgets in student loan debt. I just love this picture. We are a nonpartisan group, fiercely. In fact, for the past 3 elections, the only party that we've been able to endorse for president has been the Green Party. This problem has been allowed to fall through the cracks. And the Department of Education is the queen bee of this predatory lending instrument. One thing I didn't mention that you all should realize, unlike every other loan in this country, student loans are uniquely vacant, absent. They are stripped of bankruptcy protections, of statutes of limitations. Truth in lending laws don't apply to federal student loans. Fair debt collection practice laws, the huge carve-outs for the student loan industry uniquely. But, bankruptcy and statutes of limitations are the 2 big ones. Our founding fathers, who I hearken back to in the beginning of this presentation, they called for uniform bankruptcy laws in the Constitution, ahead of the power to declare war, ahead of the power to raise an army. So this is, the core of this problem is in the removal of bankruptcy protections. For the first 15 years of our existence, we fought almost entirely for the return of bankruptcy. But at this point, guys, we have to look at reality. And the reality is that this lending system is done. It's finished. It's toast. This pandemic is the nail in the coffin. Almost nobody is paying currently. Less than half of the people were paying before the pandemic. And, whenever this repayment suspensions was currently under for the pandemic, when that expires, very few people are going to resume paying. It's time, and this is a very conservative thing I'm about to say. I don't know why that is, but it is time to take this lending system to the bath and drown it in the tub. It is a national threat. So at this point, we're no longer only calling for bankruptcy. Only returning bankruptcy would probably force 25 million people into bankruptcy. And in an average year, less than 1 million people file for bankruptcy for any reason in this country. So it's just not practical anymore to only return bankruptcy protections. The loans have got to be canceled. Not this nonsense we're hearing from Biden, up to $10,000, up to $50,000. No. This entire lending system has catastrophically failed for everyone, particularly African Americans, but everyone. It's got to be canceled, and bankruptcy protections have got to be returned to the loans that cannot be canceled by executive order. So the stuff we like to do, you can see it for yourself. Protest is very important. Getting people in the country, 45 million people with student loans, with federal student loans, 55 million people with private and federal and co-signed. 80% of those people are screwed, and they were screwed before the pandemic. So that's 40 plus million people who should be out in the streets, but because debt is such a personal issue and the shame involved and so forth, it's really tough. So we spent a lot of our time just trying to get people off their couches and fighting for themselves and for others. It's not just us that we're fighting for, it's future generations. And because I'm talking to Connecticut, I just love Ralph Nader. We have a history together, and I could tell some stories there. But so that's my presentation. I know maybe I went a little too quick. There's a lot I wanted to say that I didn't say because of time constraints. But maybe the last thing I will say is we started a petition about a year ago this time, March of last year, calling for the cancellation of all federally owned student loans by executive order. And today, that petition has over 1 million signatures now. Just the past couple of weeks, we've really been blowing up in CNBC and other media, Yahoo News and Forbes and so on and so forth. So we are really kicking butt. And I can say again, we cannot trust the major parties. Cannot. The Republicans are terrible. The Democrats, they pretend not to be terrible, but they're terrible. They just are. And, you know, like, look at Joe Biden. Before the election, Joe Biden was saying, if you earn less than $125,000 a year, I will eliminate your student loan debt if you went to public college or something like that. He said that. So shortly after the election, and in fact, 3 times since the election, Joe Biden has come around to say, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. So, you know, we are seeing this terrible duopoly just completely conquer and enslave this country in predatory debt. And so come to check us out. And certainly we are very happy to very loudly and proudly endorse any and all candidates like Howie and Jill and other state candidates who agree with us. And I think most, if not all, probably do. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was a wonderful and terrifying presentation all at the same time. I think a lot of people understand that student loan debt is a big deal, but sometimes maybe not quite the extent until you put it into, you know, something visual like that. So definitely appreciate that. I mean, we have certainly some conversation going on in the chat. I don't know that anyone so far has posed a specific question, so I did want to open the floor up for a minute to see if anybody had a specific one. You can type it in or you can raise your hand and ask it aloud, whatever you prefer. I guess one thing that I did that I will kind of, mention while we're waiting for people to get their ones together is I was wondering if you could speak. I know you had mentioned Biden and not being truthful. And, you know, this is an issue that affects me, and I've done quite a bit of research into it myself, but, you know, not clearly not as immersed as you are. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to Joe Biden's role specifically in the repeal of those bankruptcy protections, because when I look at it, I think that he is maybe more responsible than any single person in this entire country for how bad student loans have gotten. So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, Dustin, you're not wrong. You know, Joe Biden was a senator going back to 1972. And they first started messing around with the bankruptcy laws uniquely for student loans in 1977. Now, you know, he was maybe a relatively junior senator at this time, but he was on a key committee that wrote this legislation. He was thanked heartily by the chairman of that committee when the legislation was written. We don't necessarily have a smoking gun there, but I can tell you that, again, in 2005, he was, I believe, the ranking member in the bankruptcy changes, which removed bankruptcy protections from private student loans. Now, one other couple, maybe personal stuff, but it does matter. I have heard that Joe Biden plays golf on the personal private luxury golf course of Albert Lord, CEO of Sallie Mae. You know, after that legislation happened in 2005, Sallie Mae relocated their corporate headquarters to Delaware. And Joe Biden and Albert Lord did a press conference about it live on CNBC. They were shoulder to shoulder. They seemed like they kind of knew each other and kind of liked each other. But yeah, Biden is not a good guy. He was the worst candidate in the field. And I would even include Trump in that field in this last election. We did not endorse him. And he is proving our fears out. I will say this, however, Joe Biden is a politician. If nothing else, he is that. And a year ago in Iowa, he laughed me out of the room with the very moderate question about returning bankruptcy protections. And at that point, it was just unheard of to even mention student loan cancellation. So here we are a little over a year later, and Joe Biden has, at the 11th hour during the election, suddenly embraced and endorsed Elizabeth Warren's bankruptcy agenda, which included bankruptcy for student loans. He all of a sudden started making those promises, like I said at the top of this presentation, about I will cancel your loans if you earn less than $150,000 a year. So Joe Biden can be pushed. He goes which way the wind blows. And if even 10% of the 45 million people out there, 40 million people who are underwater on their loans, actually started getting off their couch and doing, 15 minutes worth of effort a week, we could have this problem solved tomorrow. But Biden has got to be pushed. You raise a great point.
Excellent. Well, let's try to maybe transition from a sadder question involving Biden to a question of, are there any Republicans in Congress today that are supporting cancellation of student debt?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of legislative efforts in Congress calling for the cancellation of student loan debt. Ilhan Omar, Elizabeth Warren, and others. But I have to say, Congress is unable and will never be able to actually cancel student loans. Because of the pay-go rules in Congress, if you want to cancel $1 in student loans, you have to raise $1 from taxes or cutting other programs or whatever. And as a practical matter, that just is not going to happen. And by the way, we have any number of loan cancellation programs already legislated, already in place, put in place by Congress. And as I said, 99.99% of the people who try for those are disqualified. So the Department of Education cannot be trusted to even closely, fairly administering any kind of loan cancellation. So what Congress is important for is returning bankruptcy to student loans. To me, that's a necessary precondition to get any sort of meaningful loan cancellation. And on that, Congress is very important. So we're looking at people like Dick Durbin, maybe kind of close to Connecticut, David Cicilline in Rhode Island, very important. But quite frankly, we are reaching out to Republicans everywhere. We're trying to do this in a bipartisan way. There's no good reason that the Democrats should be scaring the Republicans to the other side of this issue. This is a big government monstrosity, and it's hurting states like Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Tennessee, North South Carolina, far worse than other states. So we're reaching out to Republican governors, believe it or not. We're saying, Governor, stand up for your people, not for this big government cultural enslavement mechanism or whatever you want to call it. Nothing that any conservative should support. But yeah, so we need Congress for bankruptcy, and that's just about it.
Wonderful, yeah, and I think that's a good point about saying that that it could easily be a bipartisan concern, and that there are arguments to be made on both sides of it. Because I certainly agree with you there, and just from a fundamental economic standpoint, I think it's very difficult for an economy to function when such a gigantic portion of the population is in this level of crushing debt. So
yeah, you're exactly right. This should not be, this is a very convenient, this partisan nonsense in Washington, D.C. is a very convenient shovel to bury problems like this. Now, I see a great opportunity for the Green Party, particularly right now as we speak, as people, they're getting a very bad taste in their mouth, having voted for Joe Biden based on what he promised, and now seeing him just so blatantly renege on those things. And the Republicans are just their heads in the sand on this. So, at what point are people going to be like, you know what? I'm just not going to vote for either of the major parties because they're screwing me and they always have been. I'm going to vote my conscience for once, and I don't care. I just, come what may, I'm going to vote my conscience. I would like to see that. I think there should be room for a third, maybe a fourth, maybe even a fifth party in this country. So, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. No, I definitely agree with you there. And I guess I just want to end this session or this particular part on what I find to be one of my favorite economic quotes of all time by Michael Hudson. And it's very simple. And it's just, debts that can't be paid won't be paid. And for so many of these people with student loans, like, you know, like you were speaking to the gentleman who was saying that 80% of people are underwater. And I think it's just to the point where there's just no way that those people will ever feasibly be able to pay it. So at this point, you can't even make the, oh, lazy argument or anything like that. It's just really an untenable situation. So, well, thank you so much, Alan. That was a great presentation. If you want to, I don't know if it's hard to keep track of all the stuff in the chat here, but if you want, feel free to, you know, type your org in the chat again, and everyone can go visit that. And, you know, as I was saying before, remember, any donations, we're going to be splitting those between those, you know, these organizations. So, you know, if any of the speakers so far or the next one, you know, they speak to you and you want to contribute, you can either do it directly, or if you want to contribute to us, we're going to be contributing to them as well. And it looks like Rona just posted a chat. In the chat, she posted a link where you can go and donate. So we'd certainly encourage you to do that if you're able, and we really appreciate that.